evolution because it's not adding any information into your DNA. And as an example of that, consider wingless insects. Suppose you have insects on an island. It's very windy, and they tend to be flying around. They tend to be blown off into the ocean, and they die. Well, suppose that there's a mutation that causes their wings not to form properly, and so they can't fly around. They can't be blown off in the ocean and die. They're more likely to reproduce because they're land-bound. That would be an example of a beneficial mutation because it helps the organism to survive. But is it evolution? Well, no, we've lost a structure. We've lost the information for wings. It's a reduction in information, therefore the opposite of evolution. What about antibiotic resistance? People talk about antibiotic resistance being an example of evolution. It's hard to believe, but really it's the opposite of evolution. There are certain kinds of bacteria. H. pylori, for example, this is a certain kind of bacteria that if you introduce an antibiotic into it, it has an enzyme that will break that antibiotic down into a poison, and the poison will kill the bacterium. Well, there's a mutated form of H. pylori, and when you introduce the antibiotic into it, this particular mutation lacks the ability to produce that enzyme because he doesn't have all the information there. So he can't produce that enzyme that breaks the antibiotic down into a poison. So the antibiotic doesn't get broken down into a poison. It just stays in the system. And so he survives. But here's the point. He survives because of less information. And so then the normal H. pylori, they're killed off. And the mutated form survives, and it goes on to reproduce. And pretty soon all the bacteria are resistant to your antibiotic. But it's not evolution because they haven't gained any information. They haven't gained a structure. On the contrary, they've lost information. They've lost the ability to produce that specific enzyme. Natural selection and mutations are in the wrong direction to make evolution happen. They're a downhill process, not an uphill process. And in fact, there's a scientist, Dr. Lee Spetner. He's a PhD biophysicist. And he says that all point mutations that have been studied on the molecular level turn out to reduce the genetic information, not to increase it. He says not even one mutation has been observed that adds a little information to the genome. Mutations are in the wrong direction to make evolution happen. So when we take a look at DNA and we take a look at mutations and we apply good observational, operational science in the present and we see how these mutations work, we understand that it confirms what God has said in His Word. God made things perfect at the beginning, and mistakes have accumulated with time. Ultimately, because of sin, God removed a little bit of His sustaining power. It's what we would expect based on the Bible, but it's in the wrong direction for evolution. It's not consistent with evolution. Well, let's talk a little bit about information science. Because I've talked about information. What is information? Well, you sort of have a feel for what information is. If you've read a book, you know that there's, in a book, it's got information in it because it's got a code system. If I pick up a book like the Bible, it's got, letters in it. It's got a word. Here's the word horse, for example. If I take a look at that word, and I understand that it's not actually a horse in here, but it's a code. It represents something else. It's a code system. There's a language convention. The language, this one is in English. There, you can get other versions as well. It has meaning. There are a couple of other levels of information, too, but I want to keep it kind of simple today. But if you think about it, you sort of know what information is. Well, how do books get written? How does this book get written? How does the Bible get written? How does any book get written? What if I had a magazine article up here and I'm reading that article? Where did that article come from? You might say, well, somebody wrote that article. And I would say, well, no, somebody didn't write that particular article. It was actually made by a machine that makes a lot of them simultaneously. And hopefully you would agree with that. Yeah, we make magazines a lot of them at a time. Well, where did that machine get the information? Well, probably got it from a computer. Well, where did it get the information? From another word processor on another computer. It's probably been copied a number of times, hasn't it? If you think about it, mistakes would happen. Suppose I told you that the way articles get written, nobody writes them, but in the process of copying them, mistakes creep in, and they add information to the article and make it better and better. That's how articles get written. Now, granted, most of those mistakes make the articles worse, but those we throw away. The rare mistakes that make the article better and add information to the article, those are the ones that we preserve. And that's how articles get written. There's no intelligence behind them. All that information came about as a collection of typos. Is that how articles get written? Not at all. And you instinctively know that. You instinctively know some of the laws of information science. You know that information cannot come about by a sort of random process like that. It can't originate by itself in matter. It has to have an intelligent source, doesn't it? You know that an article can be copied many times. You know that mistakes can creep into an article. Theoretically, those mistakes could make the article better by removing something from it. Like maybe there's a paragraph that wasn't so good anyway and they remove it. Theoretically, that could improve the article. But they would not add information to the article, would they? Those typos would not add information. Well, what if a paragraph gets copied? Do you have any new information? Could you read anything by reading the second paragraph you couldn't get from reading the first paragraph? You see, ultimately, you know that information had an intelligent source. information, even though it can be copied many times, ultimately comes from a mind. Every article you've ever written has a mind behind it. And that, in fact, is a law of information science. Dr. Werner Getz, he's an expert on information science. He says, there is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. That is a theorem of information science. He says, when its progress along the chain of transmission events is traced backwards, every piece of information leads to a mental source, the mind of the sender. So when we trace back this copying process, an article copied from an article copied and copied and copied, ultimately, somebody wrote it. Ultimately, there is a mind behind it.